Now an easier example. Last Friday, I gave a presentation at FlashCon 3 about Afrofuturism and the myth of the flying African. Afrofuturism is basically science fiction centering African diaspora perspectives and communities. In that talk, I discussed the difference in North American African diaspora perceptions of the metaphors of flight and rivers to relationships to broader Western ones, which draw extensively from Greek and Roman mythology, often as passed through the lens of New Testament Christianity, Protestantism, tangled up in very interesting ways. For example, in Greek mythology, rivers are liminal spaces and sites of purification and healing, and that continues in the white Western metaphorical lexicon. In the Black American oral tradition, rivers are sites of trauma and labor. Family and friends were quote unquote sold down the river in attempts to prevent community bonding that would allow for better organization and rebellion, as well as to punish enslaved people who misbehaved. Goods and services were also shipped on those rivers, including cotton and rice and sugar, and a large portion of the people performing that labor were enslaved. These threads can be seen in songs such as Old Man River, One More River to Cross, etc. This is offset somewhat by the Christian tradition of baptizing in the river, which is strongly linked to classical imagery and can be heard in the song, in the spiritual, As I Went Down by the River to Pray, but is much less a prominent tradition. The assumption of the universality of classical metaphors is often used to justify why classics as a field needs to remain as it is, rather than being further integrated into study of the ancient world and ancient linguistics outside of Latin and Greek. But since this is not true even for many students of color who have the same educational path as their white peers in the West, what can teachers do to decenter the assumption that their students will share a common cultural touchstones? These assumptions remain true in higher education and conference presentations in the majority of cases in my personal experience. The easiest interventions are linguistic. Removing metaphors that may come from Greco-Roman metaphors that pass through Christianity or straight up Christian metaphors is a great way to let your students know that you are open to different perspectives. So instead of saying a red letter day, say a great day. Instead of saying, wow, you turned water into wine, say you performed a miracle. In general, I recommend making metaphors explicit if you must use them at all. And as an aside, this really helps autistic people like me figure out what you actually mean, since many of us, especially those of us of color, do not have the same metaphorical training. If your students speak different dialects of English, incorporate their metaphors, their cultural metaphors, into your teaching, if possible. African-American vernacular English in particular is full of sensory descriptions that can add a lot of value to discussions about ancient senses and spaces. Do not make your students of color explain or introduce difficult discussions or comment on them. On the flip side, if they want to talk about how they perceive these situations or analyze texts and materials differently than their peers, let them. You might learn something that makes you think about the material in a completely new way. Content warnings are necessary even at very young ages. Also, a content warning is useless if students are punished for choosing not to participate in conversations in a classroom setting, or if conference attendees are perceived as rude for choosing to avoid certain presentations. In particular, for conferences that take place in person, content warnings should be made available prior to the conference start and published in the pamphlet and online. There's nothing worse than being in the middle of a row in a packed conference hall and realizing that you are now going to be forced to sit through a triggering discussion in full view of all your peers. This is true not just for racial issues, but for gender and disability and violence as well. Advocate for your institution to hire DEI consultants, or if they choose to work internally, to ensure that the people put in charge have done not just the reading, but the work. If they are not actively engaged in DEI and social justice efforts in their broader community, why should BIPOC students trust that they know how to do this in the classroom? Pay BIPOC for this labor. It is emotionally exhausting, not in the least because we are often the only people of color in our departments. This means that a white colleague may have a conversation about racism with us one time. But if each white colleague does it, our entire day, week, month, year just becomes one never-ending stretch of conversations about race until there's no energy left to focus on our actual research. Also, do not expect your BIPOC colleagues to be experts on racial pedagogy themselves unless they say they are. Dismantling mental systems takes time and work for everybody, and that may not have been their focus either. Make sure you have done enough unlearning in your own personal life that you are not inflicting more damage on your students and colleagues before starting these conversations and initiatives. You could be causing more problems than you're solving. Learn the art of the meaningful apology. Acknowledge your mistakes when they happen. If you speak insensitively, apologize not just to that single person privately, but correct your mistake in front of the group where you originally made it. If your students do not hear you correct yourself on these issues, they will assume you do not believe yourself to be in error. Put your money where your mouth is, metaphorically and literally. Ask your institution to provide bystander intervention training. Train yourself on the racist dog whistles used by white supremacists using the Pharos archive. Let your BIPOC coworkers know that you have their backs through actions, not just words and tweets. This is especially true when we are in person in offices, when casual remarks may come across to people of color as microaggressions, and our colleagues have a great opportunity there to step in, to intervene, and not let the onus fall on us, and not let the institutional failure to act or act to punish us for reporting fall only on us. Are you working to ensure that your department promotes and mentors BIPOC staff and researchers? Do BIPOC students who leave your institution go on to study classics because you've made a convincing case that classics is for them too? If not, maybe it's time to reevaluate your pedagogy. Do you do any public-facing scholarship that might be more accessible and interesting to BIPOC audiences than a traditional academic article? That's a great way to get involved in your local community. There are many ways to get involved and support your students and colleagues. Although, to be honest, money can be pretty great if you have that option. The decentering of the white experience in pedagogy and lectures is vital work to make sure that classics, or whatever we decide to call it in the future, a place where the work of decolonizing our disciplines and their histories can flourish. And it's also an opportunity to prevent the exclusion of BIPOC from yet another institutional opportunity and space, and to broaden what the discipline can be. There are many data points about how increased diversity contributes to an explosion in new ideas and approaches and methodologies in many different fields, including the sciences, humanities, etc. So I'm not going to get into that, but I will say that one of the joys in the face of such a terrible year filled with racist colonial nonsense and violence is seeing how many of our white colleagues are becoming more vocal advocates. Until November 2019, when I met Hardeep in Rome, I had never met another classicist of color in person, but I had also never met a white classicist who cared about these issues. I am so glad to have found many people who are enthusiastic about unlearning their biases and passing that knowledge on to their students and departments and colleagues. I also hope that I've provided here some ways in which even the shyest person can find to support their BIPOC students and colleagues. I don't want this to sound discouraging at all. I applaud all of the efforts made by my colleagues on anti-racism and gender violence and all of these other, and disability advocacy. But there is so much left to do if we are to melt down the bronze statue that is classics and recast it into something that is powerful in a completely different and exciting way, and also has no handholds for white supremacists to climb.